Welcome to Massey College. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers and I'm the principal of Massey College. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you here, both live and in a virtual audience. Massey College is built on Indigenous lands, the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are so grateful and acknowledge the privilege that we have to continue to do our work here and want to reflect on the duty of stewardship toward this land. And that's a great way to introduce this panel about Indigenous Voices in climate change. And I'm very grateful to Diane Sachs, a senior fellow at Massey College, for having thought about the idea and put together this panel. So without further ado, Diane, I'm going to pass the mic to you. Welcome to being there on such an important issue, and we continue to be together thinking about what are our responsibilities toward climate change. Diane.
Well, thank you very much, Natalie. Apparently I think I have a mic. Okay, good enough, Matt? You good? Okay. So thank you very much, everybody. Yes, so I hope that you all know that since last November, Ambassador Rosemary and I have been running a series of conversations at Massey College on climate action. We call it Massey is Missing COP26 because when we started, of course, COP26, the 26th international meeting, the Conference of the Parties on the International Treaty about Climate Change, the Intergovernmental UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there's an annual meeting. And last year, there couldn't be the meeting because of COVID. So to fill the gap a little bit, we started a series of events. We've had a number of wonderful conversations, all of which are still available, almost all still available on the Massey College YouTube channel. And I would encourage you, if you missed any, please check them out. The most recent was a wonderful conversation with Dr. Courtney Howard and a couple of junior fellows on planetary health and its role in motivating climate action. And we do know that the cost of getting off fossil fuels is going to be less than the health benefits in doing so. So don't miss that one. And the next one on November the 2nd is going to be on sustainable finance. And I'll be running that one again. We have a representative from the Insurance Bureau of Canada, one of Canada's leading clean tech investors, and some hands-on experience with getting retrofits off the ground with using property assessed clean energy financing. So don't miss that. We'll be here on November the 2nd at noon again. But one of the pieces that we didn't manage to get in the first 8 months of the series, although I tried really hard, was to have a session on Indigenous Voices. Some of you know that we had a wonderful session in February, Black History Month, on Black voices in climate action, talking about how would our choices be different if we heard more Black voices, had more Black voices at the table? But we didn't get to this question about Indigenous voices. So that's what we're going to do today. We have three wonderful panelists, one of whom is almost here and will show up when she gets here. Caitlyn Kasper from the Aboriginal Legal Services, whose expertise is on the legal aspects of Aboriginal title. And she's going to be talking to us at least a little bit about how we reconcile that with the urgent need for climate action at speed, much of which has to cross Indigenous lands, such as transmission lines. We have Riley Yesno here, who is a junior fellow, and I presume known to many of you. Riley, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Diane. Ani Bojo Riley Yesno Indigenous Yamatong First Nation in Tonje, Tikaronto in Donjaban, Ni Minwea, Kintash. I just said hello. I'm from Yamatong First Nation, which, if you know anything about Ontario geography, if you go about 300, 400 kilometers north of Thunder Bay, then you're getting into Yamatong territory, Treaty 9. I am living and working in Toronto right now. I'm also a PhD student in the Department of Political Science, and my work follows Indigenous political and social movements. I'm a research fellow with the Yellowhead Institute, and I also said I'm happy to be here, and I hope you're all doing well.
Thank you. And finally, we have Chief Patrick Michell from the Kanaka Bar Band. Chief Michell, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, yes. So I'm located. I'm sorry, I'm located in the Fraser Canyon of British Columbia.
Okay, fantastic. So we're going to start with you, Chief Michell. You've been you told us an amazing story last week about some of the measures that you and your band have been taking, but maybe start by reminding people, where is Kanaka Bar Band? Because not all of us know.
Well, let's start then. I know that I'm going to do a quick snapshot. So in my quick introduction, I said that I'm located in British Columbia's Fraser Canyon, but more importantly, I'm located in the Intelcatman Nation. So the Intelcatman Nation exists basically just north of Hope, south of Kamloops, and for about 8,000 years, we lived here at Kanaka Bar, and we used the land and resources sustainably. In 1808, Simon Fraser arrived. He's lost. He's working for the Fresh Northwest Company. First thing he does is says, I can't say Intlakatmo, so he changed their name to Kuto. And so for many years, my nation was known as the Kuto tribe. Eventually, we were translated into the Thompson Indians, and in 1982, we took back our name, the Intelcatman Nation. After Fraser arrived in 1858, gold was discovered. My nation fought a Fraser Canyon War, allowing for the colony to be declared in British Columbia, declared in August of 1858. Of course, BC joins Canada in 1871. 1876, the Indian Act is created. 1888, the Litton Residential School is opened. I'm going to fast forward now to 1988, which is the first time the world's scientists start warning us about the anthropogenic climate change. 1992, we have a 12-year-old down in Rio basically saying and reminding everybody that you're destroying the world as we know it. In 1990, my community had applied for a water license to look at the renewable energy potential of our region. And when we were on the ground, we immediately started seeing stressors in the ecosystems. The winged one, the finned one, the four-legged, and the rooted people were struggling. Something was happening. So in 1992, when that first conference was held in Rio, we put two and two together. It's anthropogenic climate change features. So as we worked through the ground studies for our hydro project, we started making observations. The mushrooms are gone. Today, the mushrooms are gone. The deer are moving away. Everything is changing as we speak, as in real time. So what we did then at Kanaka Bar was in 2015, we codified a land use plan where we summarized what it used to be like, what had happened, and basically what we could do about it. And then the following year, we did a climate change assessment and mitigation strategy. And then just in March 31st of 2021, we completed something called the Community Resiliency Plan, where everything we're doing at Kanaka Bar now, which whether it's air or water, food, shelter, energy, you name it, we filter through the lens of climate change. Is this going to exacerbate climate change? Is this harm reduction? Is this harm reversal? Is it sustainable? Is it resilient? So everything we do at Kanaka Bar now is through the lens of climate change, because we actually are bound by an obligation that we use for 8,000 years, which is to manage land and resources for our future generations. And if that means we give up today, that's fine, because that's an investment in our tomorrow. So I won't speak too much more about Kanaka Bar. What do I say? We have no children in care. We have 100% graduation. We have I just could go on. I just invite people to go onto our Kanaka Bar's website and just explore what we've done. 12 operating solar projects, 2 operating wind towers, hydro projects. We've got a brand new community building that is powered by the sun with battery storage. And so, regardless of the extreme weather events, Kanaka Bar today is. I'm gonna toot our horn. We are bulletproof. Bring on climate change.
Chief, you are so far ahead of every provincial and national government we've got in the country and almost all the municipalities. So thank you for telling us that. Well, Caitlyn's not here, Riley. So one of the things that we did want at this point, what Caitlyn was planning to do, was to explain that what Chief Michell has done, it's pretty unique. Yeah. It's an incredible inspirational leadership, but many Indigenous communities are finding it much harder.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that.
For sure. I also just want to say miigwech, Chief Michell, for sharing that. I love so many of the things that you touched on about also the ways that land rights are deeply intertwined and inextricably linked from the overall health of Indigenous communities. You talked about no children in care, things like that, that often aren't conversations that come to people's mind immediately with climate change, I think, things like that, but do have such an impact. But yes, I'm sorry that Caitlyn couldn't be here because I would have loved to also hear her expertise on this issue.
Apparently she's in a taxi.
Okay, so
she may get here
still.
Eventually.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, no, I mean, the thing that I think makes conversations about climate change in Indigenous communities also so interesting is that Indigenous communities are so diverse across, coast to coast to coast, and the legal arrangements that we have are very different from coast to coast to coast. So our ability to enact certain types of change are a lot more open and a lot more limited in certain contexts. Ontario is one of those contexts where their abilities to assert jurisdictions in the way that we're hearing about here are severely hindered by a lot of processes, by a lot of treaty arrangements that people are trying to navigate through the court systems, land claim processes, which sometimes take decades and decades before we can get to any sort of resolution and people can start asserting their jurisdiction and sovereignty. And so it's really excellent to see, in the case of BC and the Kanaka Bar, what happens when those jurisdictions are respected and when sovereignty and self-determination is enacted. We see such amazing models, but it's to say that, the situation is very, very different all across the country.
Yeah, for sure. So the first question we were going to start on is this question of really, what should the general public be learning about how to respond to climate change from Indigenous folks? And now, having said that, as we talked about before, there are two big sides, of course, to dealing with the climate crisis. One is adaptation. How are we going to cope? And we know that Indigenous people are in many ways at the front line of the disasters and suffering a lot of the adverse impacts. But what we're focusing on in this series is, what do we do to reduce the disasters? What do we do to reduce the climate pollution? And so I'm really interested in how the leadership that Indigenous people and Indigenous communities are providing in getting off fossil fuels, moving to the clean economy. What should the rest of us know about what Indigenous people are doing, and what should we be learning? So do you want to start, Riley?
Sure, yeah. So this, is this Caitlyn?
Hello, Caitlyn.
Hi.
We're glad you made it.
Yes.
So sorry, it's me to a completely different building that's renovated.
Okay, listen, take a deep breath. It's fine. Don't worry. Riley's going to start.
Yeah.
When you're ready, come sit down, put your mic on. Anyway, go ahead, Riley.
For sure. So this is a question that speaks a lot to my research personally. So I focus a lot on Indigenous movements, and what you'll notice when you start looking at Indigenous political and social movements is that care for the land is always a central core tenet. And so there are two reports that I cite very often because they're just mind-boggling to me, these numbers, right? And one is from the UN Biodiversity Commission, which said, I believe it was in 2014, that they found that Indigenous people globally, they make up about 5% of the global population. They protect over 80% of all of the world's biodiversity. Most recently, there was another report coming out by Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon. They found that Indigenous resistance movements in Canada and the US mitigate 25% of annual Canada and US GHG emissions. And that's through their resistance of mining operations, pipeline projects, damming. What those stats to show me, besides like just how, kick butt Indigenous people are at the work that they do, is also, what a disproportionate burden this very tiny percent of the population is carrying of our climate crisis. And the fact that such a small population is able to enact, such large scale change and such amazing advocacy work, I think speaks to some really fundamental things like relationships with land, values and principles about how we operate our governance systems and our social movements and our political movements that make us such, climate warriors. And those are things, and those are principles, in addition to just, stewardship practice like forest management, fishery management, very substantive things. I think that the heart of that is something that non-Indigenous people
don't have the same relationship with in all cases, and that can really like learn something totally fundamental and transformative and radical from us. And I, in fact, think that it's essential that they do, because otherwise, without those things leading the hearts of our movements, I don't know how we're going to create a sustainable future. And so, yeah, that's what I think. There's, the practical things, but also this overarching heart of the conversation that I think non-Indigenous people can gain from us.
Chief Michell, can I ask you to go next? So the question again is, what should the general public be learning from Indigenous people and Indigenous leaders that will help us all reduce our climate pollution?
Well, I'm not 100% sure about the climate pollution, but I wanted to, during my opening, I spoke about colonization and what it introduced to my community is so our Intelcatman word, again, we have a huge sense of humor here at Kanaka Bar. Colonization translates as greed. And that's what was introduced in 1858. And that's what we're struggling with, is this unique more, now, me, and complete disregard for future generations. So one of the big things that needs to be a shift is we need to stop thinking about our wallets and thinking about our grandchildren. And that's something that people need to be aware of. You got to stop thinking about the status quo. We live in a region, fortunately, and again, we talked about the diversity that guarantees all third parties negative return on investment, and we're very happy about that because it leads to very little pressure on the land and resources that's left after mining is gone, forestry's gone, agriculture's gone, tourism is gone. So again, the uniqueness of Kanaka Bar is that we've went out and we've purchased the fee simple lands in our traditional territory. We've acquired the water licenses in our territory. And what that does now, it allows Kanaka Bar to determine our future. So we have the original rights and titles issues that are very undefined, but we also have the same licenses. So we now can determine our future working in the best of both ways. Former Chief James Frank says at Kanaka Bar, we don't assert rights and titles, we implement. And so very empowering, very important, but the shift has to be, you need to think of your future and the managing of the land and resources, harm reduction, quit burning fossil fuels, harm reversal, put in natural carbon sequestration. I mean, there's so many things out there that, again, Kanaka Bar is doing. If, for example, we use electric chainsaws. We can't get an electric tractor or truck because there's none available, but at least we're able to use electric chainsaws. And so everywhere we can, we try to reduce our fossil fuel consumption. We're also bringing in meats, fruits, and vegetables. We're raising it here, so we're reducing the transportation costs and the vulnerabilities that happens when there's a systems failure. So there's so much more that could be shared. But again, it's only an hour. So I just wanted to say, stop if it's broke. What is it? Quit burning fossil fuels. There you go.
That's great, Chief Michell. I'm going to quote you. Don't think of your wallet, think of your grandchildren. As somebody with 5 grandchildren, that hits pretty home to me. Caitlyn, are you okay? You want to weigh in?
I am ready to jump in.
Okay.
So I think overwhelmingly, what needs to happen is obviously a relationship between Indigenous First Nations and where they are at this kind of colonial point in their history, where there is, finally this recognition, I think, by more and more non-Indigenous people that there are gifts and knowledge and teachings that Indigenous people have that will serve to kind of lead us forward into the future. And the issue is that in the midst of all of this kind of recognition of how important that is, we are still, as Indigenous communities, trying to figure out where our rights are. We're still locked up in all of these, land and treaty right tribunals, trying to figure out how these disputes are going to operate in terms of being decided by the adjudicator. And there is issues in that, in the sense that we have these Indigenous communities who know that they have these inherent or treaty rights to the land around them, to not only the reserve land that they live on, but also in a much broader, wider sense, the responsibilities that they have to the lands around them. And so I know a lot of communities right now, there are hundreds of land and treaty rights claims that have not been resolved, where they are still tied up in this process of trying to ensure that it's actually defined in law, what they can say no to in terms of veto power, what there is duty to consult on in terms of the government's responsibility to work with these communities. And I think that there is a huge onus that the government needs to recognize to get that done, to finish off with sorting out all the colonial harms that have been done to the communities and the loss of rights, because it's hard to move forward in terms of how we're going to caretake the land around us when we still have such a fundamental lack of understanding on the government's part as to, you know, what Indigenous communities' rights are that they agreed to in treaty signing. If there wasn't treaty signing, then it's all of the inherent rights that they have to the land. And so I think moving forward, there is, you know, great potential for us to keep gaining and learning from communities. But at the same time, it can't be a one-way relationship. You can't just keep taking and taking, recognizing how valuable these lessons are to be learned, but then also not be doing your part of that reconciliation relationship in terms of giving back what is rightfully Indigenous peoples and what was agreed to, you know, hundreds of years ago when we agreed to share this land together. So I think any kind of movement forward needs to reconcile the past that we've come from. And until we do that, it's going to be very difficult for the relationship to work symbiotically.
Chief, thank you, Caitlyn. Chief Michell, can you tell us a little bit more? How did your community manage to buy the rights in your land so that you have control? How did that happen?
Well, that's easy. We use our money.
Okay, well, why could you do it and others couldn't?
Well, because we don't invest in Walmarts, Tim Hortons, casinos, and parking lots and condominiums. We invest in our land and resources. Remember, if you can sit there, one of the things that we've learned as Indigenous population is a learned behavior. People invest in stuff that generates a business case or profit margins. Here at Kanaka Bar, we're very proudly, most of our projects are at negative return on investment too, but we generate the employment for our community. In air, water, food, shelter, whether it's renovations or new buildings, whether it's the weather stations or the water gaugings. So what we've done is we take the funding that we had, and it was very nominal, just so you know. Indigenous Affairs provides X number of dollars, but we've negotiated over time both royalty and revenue sharing agreements with both corporations and with the federal and provincial governments that generates this flow of revenues. And what's different, though, is we don't invest in economic development. We invest in sustainable and resilient infrastructure and supporting systems. And so if there's fee simple land, so we have a simple offer here at Kanaka Bar. If it's good enough for the tax man, it's good enough for us. If you want to sell your property, call me. It's a standing offer to any fee simple landowner. If you can get more, do it. The problem is there is no market for the land and resources here because of this unique location. But the fee simple landowners can still get assessed value. So standing offers, using own source revenues, having money in the bank, growing our stuff. We took all of our money out of the Ottawa Trust account and put it into our own savings accounts. So we very rarely touch the principal. We use interest. We continue to grow our own source revenues through royalty and revenue sharing agreements. And one of the jokes I've always said is we can always go Facebook bingo. I'm not on Facebook. I've heard of it though. So there's ways, and as long as you think differently, purchase the fee simple land, remove the private property sign. You've got your land and resource back. It's controversial because an Indigenous community is using the provincial touring system. But that's what's so controversial. We're securing provincial water licenses and we're securing fee simple ownership. That's scary for a lot of communities because it looks like you're buying into the system. No, with those licenses and with those lands, we don't have to handle a referral. I'm the developer, not a third party in Vancouver or Toronto or New York City. We're the developers, we're self-determining again. And that was a 30-year journey.
One more question. You mentioned that you have no children in care, and you mentioned that at the same time as you were talking about your solar panels and so on. How has this journey, taking climate seriously, helped you have a society where you have no children in the care of the provincial system?
Everybody's too damn busy working. Seriously. Have you never heard the expression, idle hands make the devil pants? God, work starts at 6 in the morning. Let's go to work, right? You work hard all day, and we're 2 hours away from any rural settings, so you can go to these rural settings. So people are having fun, right? That's the social return on investment. We're not making any money, but we have happy band members. People who want to wear a jacket that says, I'm a member of the Kanaka Bar Indian Band. Next, they'll be wanting hats. Who knows? I'm just saying is social return on investment is where it's at. It doesn't come with a profit, but it comes with a social benefit and return. Our life expectancy is already going through the roof. So healthy, happy, right? 30 years of just living in a good way rather than the stresses of the introduced way.
Boy, I wish we could all live like that. Hats, though. The hats sound like a great idea. The next question I asked each of you to think about is a question that I certainly look forward to learning more about, which is, I'm very focused on the urgency of climate action. We know that we've dragged our feet for my entire 45-year legal career, and we're now facing a cliff. We need to take urgent action fast. And what I have learned about Indigenous consultation, Indigenous processes, is they're generally not what I would have thought of as fast.
No.
So as we try to address both reconciliation and climate action, I mean, are they going to make each other harder, or are they going to help each other? Caitlyn, do you want to try this first?
Yeah, and I think it comes down to education. Like the chief was saying, we have, what has been managed to be accomplished in 30 years is nothing short of remarkable.
At Kanaka Bar.
Yeah, yes. And so we need what we have right now, and I think what the chief was referring to is the fact that we are still, a lot of communities are still trying to figure out how to even play in the Western system. There's so many kind of fundamental core concepts of how capitalism works that is not in line necessarily with traditional ways of knowledge. And so I feel like a lot of communities are just trying to still figure that part out and have a role in it to play. And so when you come to what the consequences of capitalism have been, which is significant impacts on the environment, significant impacts on our ability to be able to even address it, because now it's gotten into this desperate situation where we really do need to do this now. We need to focus on education in terms of communities having the knowledge and the wherewithal and the inherent community members that have that knowledge about climate change, about proposals, how do we work together to have renewable energy and sustaining sectors. And so I think, we really need to, once we kind of give that knowledge to communities in terms of projects that can be invested in, and also that weight on, I agree, that weight on what does social capital look like. That I think is first and foremost in terms of making our communities ready to be able to participate in these kinds of action plans. And I really hope that more of our communities kind of encourage the youth to not necessarily, become the next CEO manager of Walmart or not that kind of thing, but to really kind of step up and take the reins of projects that are absolutely in line with thinking about the 7 generations ahead, that are in line with all those things that we know are important to be able to make our communities healthy.
So Caitlyn, let me push you a little bit on this. So one of the things you and I talked about is transmission lines. As when I was the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, I reported to the legislature what is really desperately obvious to anybody who pays attention. We have to get off fossil fuels, which means, yes, we have to be more efficient, but it also means we have to dramatically increase our use of electricity. And that means transmission lines. Transmission lines are fairly easy from an engineering point of view and very difficult from a permission point of view. One of the very first things I did for the Ontario government when they first hired me back in 1975 was to start work on approvals for an electricity transmission line to go from Bruce to ESSA, and it took 30 years. Now, we don't have 30 years. Right? We are up against it in terms of climate. And so we are going to need to build transmission lines fast across Indigenous land in order to be able to stop importing and burning the fossil fuels that are destroying, among other things, everything that a lot of people, Indigenous people, care about. How can we do that? How can we get rapid acceptance of transmission lines so that we can rapidly electrify, so that we can do some of the things that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us we have to do? We have to cut our fossil fuel use in half this decade. That means we've got to get well towards doubling our electricity, which means transmission lines. How are we going to do that?
Well, Diane, I think we also talked about the fact that, there's a great deal of mining to even create the product that we would need in order to build the transmission lines in and of themselves. And so I think that there's a big difference for a lot of communities between mining and between actually constructing transmission lines on traditional territories. And so I think every community is different. Every area of land and what it's utilized for is going to be different across Canada. Some of the land might just be used for kind of hunting, fishing, those kinds of rights. There's other parts of the land that are going to be ceremonial and spiritual, and that needs to be, I think, acknowledged by non-Indigenous people in terms of where are these transmission lines going to go, where are they going to be constructed. And it's only those communities that can give you the answers to how they utilize the land around them. And so I think that, that idea of duty to consult and what does that actually mean, it can be an incredibly long, drawn out process, which is what you're talking about, that it just seems to go on forever and ever. I think there are solutions to that, and going back to that idea of, making sure that you have the community's position in terms of, if these transmission lines go up, is that going to affect migration patterns? How is that going to affect, not only the land, but the birds and the animals that live, like, how is that going to affect all those patterns? And that's why it's so important that we have things like environmental assessments done, so that communities can actually work with non-Indigenous organizations and third parties to say, okay, like, now I have this knowledge about how this particular type of structure is going to impact the lands, and then you can move forward on it, right? But you can't do that if, you're kind of coming to this, like, hitting yourself against a brick wall, not understanding why perhaps the transmission lines can't go exactly through this way, because just what that land is utilized and function for is not, it's not going to permit that, right? So I think communities just in general need to understand, the importance of these lines, what it's actually going to mean in the future in terms of sustainability. But then also there needs to be that give on the other side, that some of that land, is, you're going to have to work around it. You're going to have to reroute, because that's where that mutual respect, I think, comes from. And definitely that needs to be at the forefront for any type of planning.
there are places it doesn't belong, that's for sure. Riley, what do you think?
Well, I was just going to say that I think like it's an easy conversation to have in like the abstract, but in the reality, there's like those like 150 years of colonialism that just like brutalized any trust between Indigenous people and the government. So it's like easy to say like this is really important, but like I think if like I was in charge of a community and somebody was coming, I'm like, you always said the projects you want to push through my land are really important, you know? So like there's got to be like a really intensive like relationship restoration process before I think you're going to get like gung-ho collaborative work on these projects. And like this is where maybe the conversation about reconciliation comes in, where like, you know, there's a reason why my entire generation coined the term reconciliation is dead, is because like reconciliation has amounted to these symbolic gestures, days and statues and whatever. But then when it comes to actual things that are inconvenient and perhaps, unaffordable, like not very affordable for the government, like sharing jurisdiction, returning like these things, that's where like, you know, reconciliation stops. And is why Indigenous people and the movement that I'm most interested in being the land back movement, where Indigenous people have then instead decided we're going to take the reins in this direction then, because we can't count on, we don't trust your relationship, you saying you want to build relationships. We don't trust that reconciliation is actually anything meaningful. And so there are, I think, to your point about the youth, especially like the most rad, fastest growing generation in this country who are taking it up by storm and saying like, you know, under the very simple slogan of land back, which is actually a very robust policy position that prioritizes material gains as opposed to symbolic gestures. And that's where I see a lot of hope for the future of looking into these grassroots movements about how we can return jurisdiction and power, because it's also I think a lot easier to have these sorts of negotiations if Indigenous people truly feel that we're on like an equal footing, you know? And I think that only comes back with some of those gains, not just like, you know, talks about goodwill like we've seen for a very long time.
So Riley, let me ask you about that, because I know that the Yellowhead Institute has written about this a lot. And again, it's an area in which I am not an expert, but I'm trying to learn. So we know that we have the HE targets. We have Canada and Ontario have targets. We're going to have protected areas. We're going to have 25% protected areas by 2025, which I'd like to point out is just around the corner, and 30% by 2030.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so in Ontario, roughly like every percent, you're talking about 1 million hectares. And so to get to 30% of Ontario protected, which makes all kinds of sense in terms of water integrity, natural integrity, being able to withstand what's coming, you know, we're talking about what, an extra 15 million hectares. So that's not going to happen with trying to buy an individual little wetland somewhere in southern Ontario. We're only going to get anywhere near those numbers if we're talking about gigantic Indigenous conserved and protected areas. But what's going to happen in those areas? Are we going to be able to build this larger green economy so that we can get off the fossil fuels, or are we all going to go to hell together? Because those are our choices.
Oh yeah. I think like this is a great time to talk about provincial politics for a second, where like, if we're talking about Northern Ontario, right? Like at the same time that we're trying to conserve on these lands, Doug Ford's like, I'm going to hop on the bulldozer myself and go mine whatever. So like going back to that like point about trust is like where I don't think we actually also
Don't say
have
trust and Ford together.
No, exactly, right? We like our leadership as well, like elected leadership, Canadian leadership is not, you know, really doing the steps that they need to be taking to meet those targets in any way other than like dreaming it up and telling Indigenous people this is what needs to be happening. Like it's the double speak that Indigenous people are acutely aware of. And so as another election looms, you know, like there are more opportunities to like organize and mobilize on the climate front, on Indigenous front, and like those two, like a lot of these conversations end up happening in silos, I think a lot, like climate conversations, like there's the legal aspect, there's the Indigenous aspect and whatever, but I would argue that they're all intrinsically linked. And so we can't have one conversation without all of the others. And so, yeah, I think that we're coming up on many moments And we should have the momentum behind these moments to really grab them, to transform or begin transforming what those relationships actually look like. Because right now they're not fruitful or reciprocal or anything like that.
Well, and sorry, Riley, just to kind of like add on to what you're saying, I think it's not just politics. I think that we also have a huge sense of responsibility in the judicial system and the legal system in terms of we have these land back movements, and what we're busy doing is utilizing injunctions to remove Indigenous people from the land. And it's not about let's resolve these land disputes, like let's actually resolve what's happening here in terms of we haven't even stopped fighting over property of the land itself, never mind what we're going to do to utilize the land to profit and benefit generations moving forward. And I think that it's also the legal system itself that's complicit in like how Indigenous people are treated and where the resources are even being expended. I mean, the amount of resources that's being spent to privately prosecute Indigenous people from exercising their rights to occupy this land and say, no, you can't build on this before the actual title is resolved is, it has to start there. We have to acknowledge how this land is going to be shared before we can make moves to how are we going to utilize it to benefit generations moving forward. And we're still at a place where the government just doesn't seem to be able to come to the table to do that. And then we have a legal system and the judicial system that seems to just go along and back up instead of putting that added pressure on the government saying, you have to figure this out. These claims need to be figured out so that we can move forward and start doing this stuff like building for a sustainable future.
Boy, this doesn't sound fast. Chief Michell, one of the things that I know you mentioned just in passing at the beginning was Litton. Litton is where Canada had the highest temperatures ever recorded and then the incredible fires this summer. How has that affected your community?
Some rabbits got out and ate the cabbage.
Well, that's never...
Litton is 18 kilometers north of us. Okay, so we all know about the Litton disaster and tragedy. 1,243 people displaced. 90% of the houses and supporting infrastructure is gone. Churches, museums, administration centers, you name it, gathering halls, gone. But how has it affected me? Well, and personally, I lived in Litton, and while I'm the chief of Kanaka Bar, I lived in Litton with my wife. We lost that home. I'm living in a trailer in an old abandoned mill site today, and it's not very comfortable, and I'm not very keen on it. But it's going to take time on the short term, medium, and long term to recover. For the community itself, the loss of amenities like grocery stores and other items like that, we didn't lose our homes. We didn't lose our water systems. We didn't lose our food systems. We didn't lose or all this sort of stuff. So for Kanaka Bar, and I'm going to go out and limb, people are going to be angry at me. We're inconvenienced by the loss of this urban center that was close by. We're okay. But I'm also one of the people from Litton who lost everything. And what happened was on just prior to June 30th is that Litton is known as Canada's hotspot and always has been for quite a while. And they hit the 49.6, but at Kanaka Bar, we're at 50.4. And we already know that Kanaka Bar is on average any given day 5 degrees cooler than Litton. So the weather station in Litton, it was not 49.6. It was 7 days consecutive 55 plus degrees temperature Celsius. It has been for a number of years. There was extreme drought conditions, and there was extreme heat, and there was extreme wind. We created a flashpoint scenario at Litton that since 2017 was aware of. And so you need to make investments to protect yourself from extreme weather events.
So Chief,
Litton,
this is where this is a piece of where I'm coming from. You're living it. I'm just watching it. But I see these stories all around the world, and it gives me this tremendous sense of urgency on climate. How do you see a way to reconcile the urgency of acting on climate with these long processes of conversation before we can do the things we need to do? Help me here.
Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Come on. So I've listened to Caitlyn and listened to Riley, and I says, hey, there's a 2-letter word in English, and it's a 3-letter word in French, and it's Justin Trudeau knows both of them. Just say no. Hi, want to build a pipeline? No. Kanaka Bar was engaged for 6 years on TMX as an example. Okay. We studied it. I studied it. I read everything from cavitation to all this sort of stuff. We said no to the TMX pipeline for 2 reasons. 1, cumulative impacts on ecosystems, and 2, inconsistent with a global climate existential crisis called thing. Tripling fossil fuel to the market was inconsistent. So we said no. And guess what? Article 32.2 of DRIPA says the state shall get the free, prior, informed consent of the Indigenous peoples before the issue. We said no, and it's getting built anyway. So what we have here then is learn the word no. Number 2, stop the freaking hypocrisy. You can't sit down there and say we need to electrify Canada and BC when you're building freaking pipelines. So one of the things as we talk about trust and reconciliation is you need to listen to the Indigenous populations wherever they may be, because we offer a path forward for all of us. If you can't stop the insanity, give me the power. I want each and every one of you in this room and who listen to look up the expression, let justice prevail though the heavens may fall. If you can't stop the insanity, then recognize my ability to stop the insanity. 8,000 years we lived off the land and resources sustainably for our future generations. And if you can't, then we'll stop you. But that's not going to help climate action. But if you can't stop it, empower me. We have inherent jurisdiction over land and resource jurisdictions, and it still exists. So will reconciliation occur? No, because there's going to be a lot of angry voices out there. One of the worst words I've ever heard during all this consultation and engagement and all this blah, blah, blah crap that's going on for the last 30 years has been compromise. No, there is no compromise. It either exacerbates climate change or it's harm reduction and harm reversal, because if it's causing climate change, we're going to say no. So you better come up with an alternative. And we've supported every every transmission line through our territory. Why? Because we know electrification is the way forward for humanity. But it still pisses me off that we're getting pipelines. Now, for example, I've been trying to convince Canada and the province to buy railroads. The number 1 fossil fuel emitter in my community is these bloody diesel railroads. And I don't travel. I've been to Prince George a couple of times. I missed my Toronto session last Friday. You guys should check out the video. Why are we still using diesel railroad trains in Canada and BC? And yet I understand you can electrify easy peasy. And so we're all in support of electrification.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Chief, I'm going to cut you off there. I'm going to see if anybody here has a question for the panel. Anybody have a question? Yes.
You folks, I have heard you folks say a lot of really interesting things about what sometimes we might think of as disconnected ideas. And that's one of the biggest things that I keep learning from Indigenous people is all of these things that we're talking about separately in silos, we should be talking about together. And one of those things that I'm interested in particular is how we struggle with decolonizing our relationship to spirituality. And so I'm a settler person, and this is something that I'm thinking about a lot when I'm trying to listen to Indigenous people say, learn from us, bring these things together. So I wonder what you would say about any of you on the panel, or all of you, about how settlers can think about decolonizing relationship with spirituality so that we can actually make room for honestly and genuinely listening to Indigenous people say, these lands are important for spiritual reasons, for example.
Caitlyn?
I think that is incredibly observational in terms of how we utilize land, what position we're coming from, in terms of what's important to us, where our priorities lie, is very intricately interwoven in who we are, in terms of our spirituality, in terms of our cultural teachings. And I think that it's very difficult for non-Indigenous people to understand relationships with land when they don't come from that worldview. If you grow up as an Indigenous person, the way that you look at the world around you, the relationships that you have externally with everyone else and with your environment is very different from how non-Indigenous people have a worldview. And so when we talk about this partnership and working together and how do we move forward, unless there is an element of understanding of Indigenous spirituality and those relationships and how they operate, it's going to be very difficult for non-Indigenous people to say, yes, I can work with what you're saying. I recognize that these particular projects aren't going to work, that this particular land use is not appropriate. It's going to be very difficult for that to happen if you're not understanding where that position for Indigenous people comes from. So I think that, as you were saying, as you start to like decolonize yourself as a settler person, then it is, sitting and holding space with Indigenous people and Indigenous communities and allowing yourself to be receptive to what's being taught to you and what's being shared. But it's not something that is, it's not something that's a fast food meal. Like, you can't just order it and drive in and pick it up. Like, that's not how it works or functions. It's an investment, and it takes time from your busy schedule, like saving the world. It takes time to sit and to learn from entire groups of people. So I think that even recognizing how important it is a good first step. And then it's how and where do I find my teachers, and how and where do I make space in order to receive those lessons.
Yeah. Anybody else?
If no one else has one, I'm
okay. Riley's got a question. Yes, Riley, what's your question?
It's not a question. I was just going to add to Caitlyn's
go
point. That's okay. I really liked what you said, Caitlyn, and I just wanted to say, like, the weirdest thing I have found, like, when I talk about spirituality with non-Indigenous people, is like they seem to think a lot of the time that it's like this, like transcendent, like holier than that. Like, I think it's like also I ended up having to go to Catholic school like throughout my high school, so like the way they talk about spirituality there is very different than the way I was taught spirituality growing up. And it's not like always this like heavens opening up, whatever. It is like, as you're saying, like relationships that are cultivated and like dedicated to time and time again. Like, it's a very active, like real practice, as opposed to something like, bigger than like worldly understandings. And like, that's the thing where just, Indigenous people have thousands and thousands of years in that. So a lot of people gravitate towards them, but it is this process of relationality that anybody can engage in. But I think very few people understand that, are willing to put in the work and the time and the space, as you say, to cultivate those relationships. And then, to respect what they find through that, right? Like, there's one thing to intellectually acknowledge it, and another thing to like actively abide by it. And that, I think, is really important.
You have a question online?
Oh.
Okay, question, yes. And the question online says, sorry, I got to get closer. Would Caitlyn comment, is UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, a more effective option in enforcing Indigenous authority and stewardship over lands and resources than the domestic courts and judicial processes? Okay, and then...
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting question, because Canada historically has not I think utilized or acted on and integrated into their jurisprudence a lot of the accords that they sign on to internationally. We've clearly Aboriginal community about who they are, but actually integrating a lot of those parts of UNDRIP that are so incredibly important, especially with stewardship of the land. The courts very rarely actively engage in that, placing that agreement into their jurisprudence and then citing it as being authoritative and citing it as being binding. And I think that idea of what's binding on courts and what isn't is incredibly important. And I know I engage in a lot of litigation with respect to Indigenous people, and very rarely do we cite UNDRIP, and very rarely do courts ever reference it in their decisions with respect to Indigenous people. So I think that, you know, as this broad umbrella of where we should be looking at and drawing our knowledge from, internationally, without doubt, it should be UNDRIP, and we should be recognizing that what actually goes on in the court system and what we actually abide by is completely different. So I think that, you know, as a legal advocate, it's not very useful. UNDRIP is not as useful as what you would expect and think that it would be, which is incredibly disappointing.
Yeah. Thank you, Rosemary, for the question. We are almost out of time. There's still a lot more things that we'd like to talk about, but I do want to thank everybody for coming today, online and in person. And thank you, Alyssa and Matt, for pulling this all together. Thank you, Chief Mitchell. You've always got wonderful stories. I'm glad you did it. Riley, thank you very much. And please join us again November the 2nd. Do check out the Massey is Missing on the Massey website. If you go under our work, go to climate, you'll see that there's links to a batch of the past sessions on for example, the role of arts in leading the heart on climate action. We've got lots of things to do, but if we don't get serious about climate, I don't think much else is going to matter. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day. See you in a few weeks.